Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 11, where this week we will talk about how getting fired plays a role in mass murders as well as school shootings. Before we get to that, let's take a quick review of Module 10. In Module 10, we looked at some of the motivating factors behind mass murders and why some mass murderers choose to kill their families. So we looked at the annihilators, family annihilators. Your readings for last week were chapters 14 and chapters 15. Which included For Love, Money, and Revenge, which was chapter 14. And again, The Family Annihilator was chapter 15. You also had 5 articles to read on going postal, the Columbine shooting, an article on Lawrence Delisle, who ended up killing his 4 children in a Detroit River, Andrea Yates, who was a mom who drowned her 5 kids in her bathtub. And then you also talked about men and their extra Y chromosome. You also had 3 videos to watch. One was on the brown chicken murders, the super male extra Y chromosome again, and another video on Frank List, who was a family annihilator as well. And you also had 3 things to explore as well. One on Ronald Simmons, one on domestic violence, and one on the Columbine shooting. And then you only had one assignment last week, which was the discussion questions. If you haven't done the discussion questions yet, please do so. It's now considered late, so if you want to get marked as attending last week, please make sure that you complete that assignment. So let's turn our attentions to Module 11. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about some of the motivations of employment-related mass murders and school shootings. This could be a particularly difficult week, especially as it relates to school shootings. So if you find yourself uncomfortable or you're experiencing some difficult feelings, there are some links to some counseling references in the week 11 module that you might want to take a look at. Some of the material could be sensitive, so if you find yourself again in an uncomfortable situation, let me know. Or if you find a particular article that was difficult to read or get through, or a video, let me know. So the learning outcomes for this week, again, some of which we've already covered. Looking at, again, motivations for multiple murders, specifically mass murders, the theories of causations, the characteristics of these offenders, and some of the difficulties with investigating, apprehending, and punishing these offenders. So in Chapter 16, we specifically are talking about how getting fired plays a role in mass murders. As with most of the chapters, Chapter 16 starts off talking about a particular individual named Frank Calden. And he was being 8 months after he was fired from his job at Fireman's Fund Insurance in Tampa Bay, Florida. The former claims managers returned to get even. And this thing, he did one more thing before he did get fired. Just before noontime, he returned to the the office complex where he once worked. He was dressed in a dark blue business suit and disguised himself by wearing glasses and greasing back his hair. He walked through the double glass doors into the ground floor of the corporate cafeteria in search of his former supervisors, who he felt was responsible for his losing his jobs. Several employees were in the cafeteria, were too busy worrying about their food to notice Calden, and when he returned, one man recognized him, but he thought to himself, "Oh, I was wonder what he was doing here. Maybe he got a job somewhere else." Calden walked over to the lunch counter, ordered some food, and sat by himself near the cashier. After finishing his meal, he went outside to the patio area where he talked to a temp worker, and then all the while he was contemplating what to do. And then for about an hour, he walked back and forth between the lunchroom and the patio, watching for victims and looking for his supervisor specifically. Finally, he saw one of his former supervisors sit down at a table near the back wall. As a ploy, he walked over to the trash can next to the manager's table, took out a 9mm handgun out of a paper bag, taking aim, and pointed it at the supervisor, saying, "This is what you get for firing for me." Shot and killed the individual instantly. Moving around the table, he fired 10 more rounds within 30 seconds. He also killed a 43-year-old operations manager, a 46-year-old vice president, and 2 others, which were a human resources manager and a senior underwriter, were also shot. Just an example of one individual who ended up shooting people because of they felt they were disserviced while they were working. What's the profile of a workplace shooter? What contemplates? Why does a person do such a thing after being fired from a job? They're typically there's real like many other mass murderers. There's really no strict profile. The typical mass murderer is a middle-aged white male, again, who faces terminations or has already been fired. With a middle-aged individual, it's a little bit difficult for them to find work. So if he suspects someone who gets all the breaks that are going to be younger, they may target those types of individuals. They may also target Black people, women, immigrants, because they feel like their jobs are being taken from them. Rarely will the younger worker respond so desperately to terminations. For him, it's a loss of a job, not necessarily a career, and merely take it as a temporary setback. So a 20-year-old may just go on and look for another job, whereas someone who's 40, 50, or older who can't find another job may find it actually be the end of their work life and feel like someone is not going to hire them. Most of these individuals are vengeful, murderous employees are men, and most were born several decades ago where work is kind of defines who they are. Younger people don't really get defined by who they are where they work because they just look a lot of your early 20-year-olds, especially your young 20-year-olds, are somebody who could at least feel like they could get a job somewhere else. Sometimes social changes are exacerbated by the post-industrial economy, which is desirable middle-income jobs, especially those in manufacturing, are becoming more and more difficult. And for a variety of reasons, including foreign competitions, recessions, computers, etc., job market for some of these people has been worsened. Millions of people get displaced because of different reasons, jobs relocating, downsizing, etc. While the majority of these individuals are men, women aren't immune to this as well. The chapter talks about Amy Bishop, who was a 45-year-old assistant professor. I'm sorry, Amy Bishop, if I got that name right. She was upset over being denied tenure at the University of Alabama. And in February of 2010, she showed up one Friday afternoon to a faculty meeting, sat through the meeting, and then after the meeting was over, started shooting her colleagues. So it's not just immune to women, to men. A lot of these individuals have an unstable work history, could have also have caused problems at their work. They didn't get the promotions or a transfer that they wanted. They may have taken out their frustrations on these individuals. Some other forces that contribute to mass murder kind of go beyond the financial matters. Sometimes these people have relationship issues with their coworkers. The article talks about somebody who worked for the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority. The individual was really upset with their coworkers who ended up quitting, and because after he ended up quitting, he still was upset with his coworkers and went to his place of employment and shot his coworkers because he felt they were out to get him. Sometimes there's mixed motives. Sometimes profit could be a motive that's also combined with revenge. The book talks about an individual named John Taylor who was more than furious. He was upset because Wendy's fired him without cause, and then they filled his position with somebody else who wasn't nearly as qualified as him. And the former Wendy's manager became obsessed with getting even with the man who replaced him, and went to the restaurant where he had worked, showing him what could happen if just before closing time, Taylor went into the restaurant with an accomplice and entered a fast food restaurant, waiting for the customers to leave, sat eating as coworkers cleaned up for the day. The two men walked into the manager's office where Taylor pulled out a gun and shot Augustine. Yeah, first he threatened him to hand over the $2,400 that was in the safe. And then when he ordered all employees to come into the office, and they ended up shooting them in the office. Another example of mixed motives would be a military post.
An Army psychiatrist opened fire at Fort Hood outside of Kylie, Texas, where he killed 13 people killed 13, injured 30 before he shot himself. He turned out to be a major at the age of 39, with a Muslim American who gunned down his colleagues after suffering a string of negative evaluations. So he got bad evaluations and took that out on other military individuals. Sometimes there's a thing called murder by proxy. Um, an individual by the name of Joseph Westbacher, who actually had very little to do with the killers, um, he he, um, he would Westbacher would go through and kill some people who may have been friends with them. I think you saw this at the Columbine shooting as well, where the Columbine shooters would bypass certain victims who may have been friendly to them to find the people that were not not as friendly with them. So sometimes they will skip certain victims as well. Sometimes romance could play a role in it. Someone maybe have tried to refute someone's advances, and then they come to work and take it out on not only the person that refuted their romantic attempts, but also other coworkers as well. The book talks about a 39-year-old Richard Farley who was so obsessed with his 25-year-old coworker that he would do almost anything to get her. For almost 4 years, Farley, who was a software engineer in California, pestered, threatened, intimidated, walked in the target of his desires, found her smile irresistible. But the victim never really returned his affections. She only wanted to pursue her pursuer to leave her alone and could get on with so she could get on with her life. He continued to send letters, called her at work, bought her gifts, etc. She continued to hold her ground, and finally, she finally had no other recourse but charged her stalker with sexual harassment on the job, and he ended up getting fired from his job. Um, so he found it harder to keep an eye on this loved one, so he was running out of time and running out of money. Before he could find a job at another place, he ended up losing his house, his car, and owed $20,000 in taxes. Um, he continued to have a fixation on her and ended up going to where she worked and he ended up going to her work with 2 shotguns, an assault rifle, and 4 handguns, as well as 1,100 rounds of ammunition. And after sitting for a while and consider what to do, he climbed out of his motorhome that he brought to his place of work with his weapons, walked towards Laura's building, and was to get revenge against the company that protected her and fired him. And would get even with her and commit suicide as well. He ended up firing his 12-gun shotgun at a man who just happened to be coming out of a building and blasted his way through the security door. Third victim fell. People just kept falling as he approached the stairwell. After a 5-hour standoff, in which he shot several people, he ended up killing 5 people and injuring another at the plant where he had once worked. Sometimes these individuals, these disgruntled employees, don't take their anger out on the company. Some blame themselves and become depressed, consider suicide as their only options. Some may take out the frustrations on family or loved ones, and then they become family annihilators. But they tend to externalize blame and not take responsibility for themselves. A lot of them will say things like, "It's not my fault. The boss doesn't give me good work, so I can show what I can do." And then it goes on to talk about another example where someone fell under this umbrella. Even disgruntled employees who hold their bosses and colleagues responsible for the misfortunes may not turn to mass murder, especially if they enjoy strong support systems. But a lot of these mass murderers who go and get retribution on their employers tend to be socially isolated. Um, they tend to be loners. They may live by themselves, and they may have recently got a divorce or had moved thousands of miles away. Once socially isolated, they regard work as their only meaningful part of their lives. Therefore, when they lose their jobs, they seem to have lost everything. Some employers, if you notice, when you apply for jobs, have to go through some sort of rigorous background check. And so a lot of these pre-tests that people have try to screen some of these people that might have a propensity to commit things like this. Many companies can do a better job of screening applicants. They might be able to find some of these individuals. It may not necessarily be feasible or even possible for privacy reasons to complete a full background check. For example, if I were having mental health problems and seeing a private therapist for this, and then I would go and apply for a job, I obviously wouldn't list on my application that I've had mental health problems or anything like that. The only thing that could really look for is a past history of employment, where if I had gotten fired from a job, um, my past employer could obviously disclose that. They couldn't necessarily disclose why I got fired, but they could just say something like I'm not eligible to be rehired. Um, if you ever notice, if you ever do background checks, which I used to do for a period of time, um, when you go to try to verify employment, typically what they'll do is they'll verify the employment that the person worked there, and they'll either say whether or not the person is eligible for rehire or not. They can't get into reasons for privacy reasons to say why a person was fired. And then the article, or in the chapter 14 concludes again, which we talked a little bit about last week, about going postal, and what that exactly means and what that looks like. Um, They talk about an individual in 1991, Joseph Harris, who was a postal worker in New Jersey. He armed himself with an assault rifle as well as other weapons, went to the home of his former supervisor and slashed her to death, and then fatally shot her fiance. Then he went to the post office at about 2 a.m. and killed two mail handlers who had just come into work for the night shift. And then after a 4.5 hour standby, he finally surrendered and got the revenge he sought, and it was time to give up. So they went to his house and basically saw that he was essentially armed with a bunch of explosives. So that talks about that as well. And then in chapter 17, we talk about the well-schooled in mass murder. The chapter starts off talking about an individual by the name of Patrick Purdy, who, uh, give me 1 second. Um, Patrick Purdy was a young man filled with resentment and went on a deadly rampage of his own, and when his half brother would make the newspapers that precisely he would end up making the headline. Um, um, so the article talks about a bunch of different things as it relates to school shootings. There's different ones in different states. Um, Purdy was an individual who was constantly in trouble with the law. One time he was in trouble for soliciting a sex act from an undercover police officer. Um, Purdy's one that's very well known. He ended up going into He was a Cleveland shooter. He ended up shooting, going into Cleveland 20 years after he'd finished going to school in Cleveland. Um, uh, I'm sorry. Purdy was the chapter also talks about Adam Lanza, who you probably know as an individual who was the one that did the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in 2012. Shot and killed 20 first graders and 6 adult teachers or other people that worked at the school. So there's countless examples of school shootings. We hear about those more and more a lot. The large majority of the perpetrators are individuals who are former students of the school. Both Purdy, Lanza, and Ramos were also were now adults and went back to the schools that they went to. Another individual, his name was Luke Whittam. In 1997, he was in school and pulled out a gun under his coat and began shooting people in school. There's also in the chapter this week, there's a list of school shootings between 1988 and 2002 that list all of the school shootings. Purdy's happened in Cleveland, It was Cleveland, but it was in Cleveland, California, in which he injured 29 students and killed 5 students. That may be considered one of the bigger shootings as far as a number of victims. There were 30 victims at that time, but there were only 5 people that died. Probably the biggest shooting where people were killed was Sandy Hook, where 20 students were killed and 6 adults, making it 26. So Sandy Hook is the biggest one as far as number of killings. Cleveland with Purdy was the number of most of the victims. 30 people were shot, where only 5 people were died. And there's other ones. The ones in Florida, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, there were 17 victims. There were 17 people shot and killed and 17 people injured for a total of 34 people. So that's another big one, obviously, as well. So a lot of these people that commit these acts of school shootings are ones that are involved in our disgruntled students who go back in school. Some of them aren't necessarily students. Another good example of that was Columbine, which happened in call it 1999. There were 13 people that were killed in that and 24 people that were injured. So that's another big one as well. Columbine was committed by were the individuals who were involved in Columbine. That was Eric Harris and Dylan Kiebold, who were, I don't want to say they were nerds per se, but they were the kind of students who didn't fit into the mainstream part of students. For months and months and months, they were planning and preparing for this type of act. They kind of carried it out in what would be kind of like a video game type of way. And so they were seen as geeks and nerds by the large majority of the students. They kind of created their own little group called the Trenchcoat Mafia, and they recorded a lot of videos about what they did. So they kind of did it in a different kind of way. And they terrorized the school for several hours. I shouldn't say several hours, for a period of time before the law enforcement took over. So yeah. Sometimes there's people that plan to commit these types of acts that end up getting caught. There's situations in which a disgruntled student's plan to carry out a bloodbath is averted before or any damage is done. In many instances, a third party, a student or a staff member, kind of catches wind of these things and lets police departments know about it. So sometimes we hear about these things where people will hear about something that's going to happen and then end up letting law enforcement or somebody else know about that as well. I don't want to spend too much time on this chapter because I've already think I spent a lot of times, simply because I think it's a really good chapter, and I think you're going to read it. I think you probably heard about a lot of these things. Some of the risk factors probably that I'll conclude with is some of these perpetrators end up being victims of being bullied or don't have strong social bonds with other classmates. Other ones tend to have, I don't want to say they blame violent video games on it, but there's video games play a role in it, and sometimes they're not able to determine the difference between reality and pretend. Some of the school shooters copycat other types of things, and they want to make themselves bigger known in the media as somebody else. So they will copy other types of murders. And then the school shootings aren't just left to high schools or elementary schools. There's a lot of examples of um, college shootings. We've talked about Virginia Tech already. We also talked about the University of Texas. There was another one in our own backyard at the University of Arizona in 2002. And an individual named Robert Flores ended up trying to shoot, or he went to the nursing school and ended up shooting several people. So the chapter talks about some of the shootings in colleges. Probably the biggest one would have been the Virginia Tech shooting, where Sing Hui Cho killed 32 people. That was probably the biggest one. The aforementioned 2002 one at the University of Arizona only had 3 victims, but the biggest one, of course, was the Virginia Tech one in 2007, when 32 people
were shot and killed. The most recent one was in February of 2023. Michigan State University, Anthony McRae shot 3 people. One of the differences between him and most of the other offenders is he was older. He was 43, where most of the other ones were a little bit older than college age. So there's a lot of different factors. Probably the biggest one is the students are outcasted. So that's chapter 17. You have also in week 11, you also have some other additional readings. You have an article about a man who kills 3 of his bosses at his ex-firm and then shoots himself. There's an article about Amy Bishop, who's the professor I mentioned, who shot several of her colleagues. And another one on the FBI inquiry into Hassan. There's also some videos to watch on the Louisville Standard mass shooting. Another one on the Major Hassan, as I told you about before, who was the Army psychiatrist who in 2009 went on a rampage. So there's a video and an article about Major Hassan. Another one on the Stockton Cleveland Elementary shooting. And there's a movie actually to watch called Stalking Laura, where Laura Black begins her promising career in Silicon Valley in the 1980s, and she attracts the attention of Richard Farley, who I mentioned in chapter 16, I think it was, I just mentioned. Yeah, so there's actually a movie made on that as well. There's also several things that you should explore that are supplement to the other things that I did read to you. Chapter 11's discussion questions are, there are 4, or actually there's 5 of them, where you're going to talk about the characteristics between the high school shootings and the college shootings. I'm going to talk about the different things that we are practicing now, where it used to be that we duck and cover things, but now we're having our students pass a plan for mass shootings. You could talk about the copycat effect. You could talk about video games, and there's another one that talks about the publicizing of serial killers or mass murderers as well. No one talks about Robert Flores' killings. So again, pick one of these questions, answer it by Thursday, and respond to your classmates in a meaningful manner by Friday. Your assignment for this week is a short writing assignment, which you're going to review some of the material that I have included in this assignment. One of them is called What's a Professor to Do? And it has to do with school shootings. Assume that you are the college, your college and the counseling center. So imagine that you're a college professor. One of the students in your classes does not say much, but scowls and scowls throughout the class. You notice that his body, his language is not very good, and you sense he might become violent and has not actually done or said anything that's threatening. Based upon what you've learned this week, what have you read, watched, and researched, you strongly suspect that the student could be violent in your class. So given that the resources that are provided, what do you think the college would expect you to do about the student above? Do you feel that it would have been, do you think you have enough resources to take legal action, et cetera, et cetera? Finally, discuss whether or not there could be some sort of better solution or not. So this should be about 150 to 300 words. Again, type it into the text box and you should be good to go. So that's it for this week. Just to kind of review really quick, you have 2 chapters to read, 3 articles, and 4 videos to watch. You have your discussion questions to complete, as well as a short writing assignment. So that wraps up Module 11. Just to look ahead to Module 12, we're going to talk about what motivates mass murderers to take out their frustrations on the government workers, as well as the motivation between hate-based mass murderers. You'll have 2 chapters to read. One entitled Fighting City Hall, one entitled Hate Motivated Mass Murderers, but we'll get more into that next week. That wraps up the material for this week. If you have any questions, let me know. If you don't, have a good week, and I look forward to talking to you next week. Thank you.